Buenos días. Vamos a tener una nueva sesión de la Cátedra ICADE Fundación Notariado sobre seguridad jurídica en la sociedad digital, dedicada al tema de la inteligencia artificial, que es la cuestión que viene centrando nuestra preocupación en este año académico. In consideration of our guests, I will continue in English, okay? So last November, we held an international congress here dedicated to the relationship between AI and law. What we asked ourselves then was the question of to what extent is technically possible and also socially and politically acceptable that the tasks of the jurists, and especially of the judges, can be automated and performed by AI devices, programs, or applications. Or in other words, to what extent law is computable. In the monographic session that we are holding today, we deal with AI from another point of view, as a social phenomenon that can itself be object of regulation. As it is well known, technology and social and economical life are always ahead of the law. First, a new social reality appears, which generates new concerns and problems, and after a while, the law reacts, and legislators end up dealing with this new reality. This is exactly the case with AI. Since a few years ago, we have all lived surrounded by more or less intelligent applications that increasingly condition and affect our interest, not only when an automated system provides us with certain information about the weather, the traffic, the flights to Canary Islands, but also and increasingly when we apply for a loan or for a job offer. But and all this new reality has been developing in a situation of anomy with no specific regulation. But the case is that in this very moment in Europe, this is about to end. All of you know that the very complex legislative process that began in 2021 is currently ending. After the agreement reached by the government representatives last February on the text of the regulation of AI, the European Parliament gave its approval to this text on March 13, just 3 weeks ago. With this, the process has not yet concluded, but what remains are only details of wording, translation to other languages, and there will still be a vacatio legis of 2 years, except for some issues. But in any case, we will soon have an absolutely pioneering European rule attempting to establish a wide-ranging regulation of this phenomenon. It is a regulation, as is known to anyone who has read a little bit of this rule, very extensive, massive, very technical, and extraordinarily complex. In particular, it is a rule that affects important economic issues. There are many economic interests, but also political and ideological ones that are at stake here. And behind some of the articles of this regulation, there has been an intense lobbying activity and a lot of pull and release, tira y afloja, as we say in Spain. So without knowing that background, it is very difficult to understand many parts of this rule. And that is why we have here today the presence of 2 young but highly qualified researchers who have not only been concerned for some time about the legal issues raised by the new information technologies, but who have especially followed the process of drafting this regulation, and they can provide us with a very valuable information. They both come from Germany right now because they are senior researchers at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. Gustavo Gil Gasiola is Brazilian. He studied law at the Ribeirão Preto Law School at the University of Sao Paulo. He has a master's degree in engineering and intelligent regulation from the Polytechnic School of the same University of Sao Paulo, with a study on automated systems for the control of road transport of dangerous products, and a doctorate in data protection in public administration from the University of Passau in Low Bavaria, Germany. Before joining the KIT, he worked as a consultant on data protection in Germany and as a professor of new technologies in administrative law in a postgraduate course at the Escola de Advocacia Geral da União in Brazil. As for Paul Friedel, he's German. He studied law first in Munich and afterwards in Berlin at the Humboldt Universitat, where he obtained his doctorate. He has also studied in Italy, in Rome and in Florence. He's currently a clerk at the Berlin Regional Court and a postdoctoral researcher at KIT, and is also an affiliate researcher at the Information Law Institute of New York University. Its interests focus on the legal treatment of data and internet governance, and especially in the governance of AI. And in particular, Gustavo and Paul have very recently published jointly a short but very interesting paper on the latest version of the text of the regulation that concerns us here, where they show a deep knowledge of its content, as is possible, and also provide a reasoned critical view. And for me, it's been enough. Now I give you the go. Thanking you with all my heart for the effort of coming here to share your knowledge, your science with us. Okay. So, Gustavo.
So, buenos dias, everyone. Thank you for the nice introduction. And I would like to thank for the invitation to be here at the Universidad Comillas. It's really nice to be here in Madrid and to discuss this new regulation. I think now is the right time to discuss it. We have a lot of problems that we don't have the answer yet, and I'm happy to be here to share my initial thoughts with you. And I'm also looking forward to discuss these topics here at the University of Comillas. I will set my time that I not exceed my 40 minutes. So, Ms. Cabrera asked us to talk about the landmark points of the AI Act, and I would like to talk about the actual structure of the AI Act, and in particular, the risk-based approach that was the regulatory option from the Commission and was followed through the legislatory process. After this brief introduction, can I use this? Yes. After this brief introduction, my presentation is divided in two parts, and then I will have a conclusion. The first part, I'll take a look at the development of the risk-based approach of the AI Act. I'll focus on the rationale behind the Commission's proposal for a risk-based approach regulation. And in the second part, I will outline the risk-based approach regulation that was adopted in the last March. My intention is to understand the different risk levels and the criteria to classify the AI systems. And where necessary, I will highlight the changes that went from the Commission's proposal into the adopted AI Act. Before I start, I would like to make two introductory remarks. First, when I refer to the AI Act and the articles, the numbers, I am referring to the last version, the adopted version from March 2024. It's not the official version, the last version was already mentioned here, but I think it's really close to this final version. And second, there are different concepts of sorry, there are different concepts of risk-based approach in the regulatory discourse. But now here, I am, however, interested in the kind of risk-based approach that the Commission has in mind. In this way, the risk-based approach refers to a regulatory framework in which two or more levels of risk are defined, and the relevant rules for a specific AI system depends on the assignment of the risk level. Later, we'll see how the levels and the assignment of risk levels will work at in the AI Act. But first, we need to understand the rationale behind this risk-based approach that was proposed by the Commission. So it's possible to identify a clear development of the legal framework for AI in the EU, at least from the Commission communication AI from Europe from 2018 to the Commission's proposal in 2021. In 2018, the Commission in its communication pointed to the need of appropriate legal framework for AI, and at that moment, we don't find any mention of what kind of regulation they meant. They just meant that we need an adequate regulatory framework. Already in 2018, the Commission established a high-level expert group on AI, which in 2019 delivered the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI. And in this document, they recognize that AI brings significant benefits to individuals and society, but also poses certain risks that can result in negative impacts. Therefore, the ethics guideline calls for an adoption of measures to mitigate the risk while ensuring the benefits of AI for society. More than appropriate regulation, the ethics guidelines argue that adequate measures should be taken when appropriate and proportionate to the level of risk. The idea of proportionate measure is really important because it's at the heart of the risk-based approach that will be developed later. In 2019, in education, building trust in human-centric artificial intelligence, the Commission welcomed the ethics guidelines as a valuable input for policymaking and mentioned that the requirements for AI system should take into account the specific context in which they are applied, and also they have to take an impact-based approach. We have here two interesting ideas that bring us closer to the risk-based approach: the context and the impact. The regulation of AI is challenging because there is no clear or easy definition of AI, and these systems can be used in different contexts, from social to industrial and public administration. It is therefore important to take into account the context which they are used, and the rules should be tailored to their impact in that context. Then in 2020, when the Commission issued the white paper on AI, we can finally see these ideas of proportionality and context that will support a risk-based approach for AI regulation. After some remarks on the need to regulate AI, the white paper outlines the key elements of a future regulatory framework and explicitly mention the risk-based approach. And I would like to quote from the white paper: as a matter of principle, the new regulatory framework for AI should be effective to achieve its objectives while not being excessively prescriptive, so that it could create a disproportionate burden, especially for SMEs. To strike this balance, the Commission is of the view that it should follow a risk-based approach. This risk-based approach outlined in the white paper is simple. It identifies AI systems that pose an unacceptable risk and should be banned, and high-risk AI systems that should be regulated to minimize the risk they posed. In order to classify AI system, the white paper already proposed some criteria. For example, including the identification of critical areas and the specific use and the relevant impact on right and security. I want to discuss about the public participation during the legislative process and how citizens understand the risk-based approach. But I think I don't have much time to talk about it, and I would just skip this part, because then we can get to the AI Act and talk about the different criteria and classifications. So, following the consultations that was made after the white paper, the Commission prepared an inception impact assessment that was also open to contributions to stakeholders, and they supported a risk-based approach, but just with two categories: the unacceptable risk and high-risk AI systems. And I quote from the conclusions from this inception impact assessment: there is a majority view, more than 90% of the stakeholders who reflect on this question, that if legislation is necessary, the EU legislative instrument should be limited to high-risk AI applications. That means this reflects the idea from the white paper that they needed an acceptable risk AI system that should be banned and a high-risk AI system that should be regulated. So in 2021, the Commission concludes in its impact assessment accompanying the AI Act draft that the regulatory intervention chosen was, and I quote, a horizontal EU legislative instrument following a proportionate risk-based approach, plus codes of conduct for non-high-risk AI systems. As we have seen, the development of a risk-based approach for AI was mainly limited to these two categories: unacceptable risk and high-risk systems. However, as we've seen in the next section of my presentation, this conclusion is partially inconsistent with the Commission's view and do not faithfully describes the actual structure of the AI Act. So, in my next part for my presentation, I would like to discuss a little about the actual structure, what we have now with this approved version. So the risk-based approach, as we already noticed, assumes that AI can be classified according to the risk they posed, and that depending on this classification, the AI system will be subject to certain risk requirements. In other words, the AI system that are classified at a higher level of risk should be subject to stricter rules than AI system that's classified at a lower level of risk. Because of that, clarity about the levels of risk and also the criteria for classifying AI system is the key to an effective functioning regulatory system. If the level of the risk is not clearly defined or the criteria is not precise, the subject that are subject to this regulation do not know which requirements they have to comply with. And from this perspective, I would like to analyze the AI Act. In which level we can say that the levels are defined, and also the criteria to classify AI systems are also precise. Our first impression is rather disappointing. I would say, despite the strong discourse around the risk-based approach, the AI Act explicitly defines only one level of risk. and indeed, it's the most important level of risk is the high risk AI system. The other levels of risk, they need some interpretation, are not explicitly defined in the AI Act. Instead of that, however, the Commission tries to explain the levels of risk that are implied in the AI Act, but even the Commission's information is not harmonized or precise. We can find in its website different categories from risks, and we can notice that's not even clear for the Commission how it works. I bring here two different websites from the Commission, the official website, and here we can see two different classifications from the same legal framework. At the first one, we have here a graph with four different categories of risk and are structured one below the other. We have the first one at the top, the unacceptable risk category, and then the and then we have the high risk category, followed by the limited risk, and then the minimal risk. After in other website, in the Q&A from the AI Act, the Commission brings a slightly different classification with minimal risk, small risk, an acceptable risk, and then specific transparency risk that substitute the limited risk. We see that here it's not just the structure is different, but how the list is structured, but also that the limited risk was substituted by this specific transparency risk, and maybe it shows that the Commission have now a better idea of how the AI Act works. And I would like to go on each one of these risks to try to understand how we can classify AI systems, and if this classification makes sense after all. So the first category is unacceptable risk. And at the top, this unacceptable AI practice poses an acceptable risk and should therefore be banned. As recital 28 makes clear, this AI practice, and I quote, contradict human values for respect human dignity, freedom, equality, democracy, and the rule of law, and fundamental rights enshrined in the Charter, including the rights to non-discrimination, to data protection, and to privacy, and the right of the child. This means that the legislation on basis of abstract risk assessment, that is, without taking into account the context of the application, consider that the risks involved are unacceptable and that this practice should consequently be banned. It is interesting to note that the AI Act speaks of AI practice here in this category and not in AI systems as in the case of high risk. This may indicate that the practice and not the system itself that should be banned, but this distinction is also not clear. We find the list of prohibited AI practices in Article 5. For example, AI Act prohibits the AI system that use subliminal techniques with the objective to materially distortion a behavior, or also systems that exploit any of the vulnerabilities of an individual or a particular group. This list of prohibited practice was already included in the Commission's proposal, but has been extended during the legislative process. But these prohibitions from Article 5 are not without exceptions. In some cases, the AI Act allows the use of certain systems or the practice under specific conditions. This is the case, for example, of the use of real-time remote biometric identification systems in public spaces for law enforcement purposes. Despite the general prohibition, the AI system can be used if it is strictly necessary for a specified purpose, for example, to prevent terrorist attacks. As the AI Act creates exceptions for unacceptable AI practice, we can ask whether the AI practice exempted from this category should be classified as high risk, or whether it's possible to assign a different level of risk to this AI system. For some practice, for example, for law enforcement, it would make no difference, as this area is assumed to be high risk according to Annex 3. But however, it's not the case for every accepted practice. And another problem we can have here is that if the accepted practice is deemed to be high risk, it's also unclear whether the exceptions for high risk classifications can be applied. And I mean that the high risk AI system does not pose significant risks, as we will see in the next category. In short, the AI Act has failed to clarify the possible dynamics in this level of unacceptable risk AI systems. The next level is the high-risk AI system. For the classification of this system, the AI established two criteria in Article 6. The first one is related to the new regulatory framework, that is a set of rules that regulate product safety. Accordingly, the AI system should be considered high risk if two conditions are met. The first condition, the AI system is intended to be used as a safety component of a... Thank you. Thank you. So the first condition, the AI system is intended to be used as a safety component of a product, or the AI system is a product itself covered by union harmonized legislation mentioned in the Annex 1 and 2. And the second condition, this product should be subject to a third-party conformity assessment with a view to being placed on the market or put in service. It is interesting to notice that for an AI system to be classified as high risk under the AI Act, it is not a condition that the product is also classified as high risk under the harmonized legislation, because the third-party conformity assessment is not necessarily reserved to high-risk products. We can then have a situation where the product is classified as medium risk under the new legislative framework, but for the AI Act, the AI system that is intended to be used as a safety component, or the product itself, is classified as high risk. In this way, there is no direct and necessary link between the classification of risk under other regulations and the classification under the AI Act. The second criterion for classifying AI systems as high risk is Annex 3. According to Article 6, Paragraph 2, the AI system used in the areas listed in Annex 3 should be classified as high risk. And among other critical areas listed in Annex 3, we have, for example, remote biometric identification, critical infrastructure, education, employment, law enforcement, migration, asylum, border control management, and so on. There's a long list of critical areas. This criterion was, however, hotly debated through the legislative process because we are talking here about which AI system will be subject to the mandatory requirements from the AI Act. In particular, the possibility of exempting or declassifying high-risk AI system was changed several times. And I think it's important to look at the different proposals from the commissions and the European Parliament and also the Council, and then to look at the adopted version. So the Commission proposal was quite simple and didn't include an exception for AI system used in the critical areas listed in Annex 3. In other words, if an AI system would be used in the critical areas, it would be classified as high risk without considerations about the specific context or the specific AI system. This proposal considered that the abstract risk assessment carried out by the legislator or the Commission in creating or updating this Annex 3, that is without consideration about the context, would already define the AI systems that would pose significant risk to security, to fundamental rights, and to environment, and should therefore be subject to the mandatory requirements. The provider or the deployer would only need to identify whether its AI system falls within the areas listed in Annex 3, and if so, the AI system would be classified as high risk and subject to the relevant requirements. This proposal would not allow the provider or deployer to challenge the classification through, for example, a concrete risk assessment that shows that there is no significant risk. This simplified proposal for the classification of high-risk AI system was modified during the legislative process, and both the European Parliament and the Council proposed a substantial adjustment to include a more concrete risk assessment that takes into account the specific AI system and the context. According to both proposals, an AI system would be the AI system would be classified as high risk if two conditions are met. First, the AI system is intended to be used in the areas listed in Annex 3, and second, the AI system in question would have to pose a significant risk to security, to fundamental rights, or the environment. This proposed categorization makes out somewhat contradictory, as the legislator already assessed the risk in the listed areas. However, the second condition, this concrete risk assessment, would allow to take into account the context and the specific AI system. In other words, this proposal entails a two-step risk assessment to classify a system as high risk. The first one is an abstract risk assessment and is carried out by the legislator or the Commission. And the second one is a concrete risk assessment carried out by the provider. The adopted version of the AI Act differs slightly from the amendments proposed by the European Parliament and the Council, but it also includes a concrete risk assessment. According to Article 6, Paragraph 1, the AI system intended to be used in the areas listed in Annex 3 are initially considered to be high risk. However, Article 6, Paragraph 3 accepts AI system that does not pose considerable significant risk of harm to the health, safety, or fundamental rights of natural person, including by not significantly influencing the outcome of decision making. In addition, the article provides also some examples of this of these cases in which there is no significant risk. For example, when the AI system is intended to perform a narrow procedural task, or where the AI system is intended to improve the results of a previously completed human activity. So in the adopted version, Annex 3 provides for a predefined areas, as mentioned in recital 52 and 53, and should be considered high risk AI systems unless the provider considers through a concrete risk assessment that the risks aren't significant. The introduction of this exception mechanism also pose some difficulties to understand the risk-based approach. If the AI system used on one of these predefined areas does not pose significant risk, it won't be considered high risk. That's clear. The problem is that this AI system cannot fall in the other risk level defined by the Commission, the limited risk or the minimal risk, as it will still be subject to some special set of rules. In fact, we would have to consider a special classification, the non-high risk, or we can also name as an intermediary level just below the high risk. At this intermediary level, the AI system will not be subject to the requirements for a high risk AI system, but it will have to comply with certain requirements. For example, the provider from this AI system will have to document this concrete risk assessment and also make the document available for the national authorities upon request. Other requirements for this kind of AI system is they are subject to registration in the EU database for AI systems. So it's not the same as the minimal risk AI system. They have a special set of rules. Anyway, it's understandable that the consideration of the concrete risk posed by an AI system is important in order to tailor the stricter requirements for the AI system that really pose significant risks for individuals or society. It makes no sense to classify an AI system that does not pose a risk because it's just a narrow procedural task, just because it's used in a critical area. From this point of view, the Commission's proposal, proposal of an abstract assessment to identify critical areas may be seen as too broad and therefore not really proportionate. However, the solution adopted is also far from ideal, as the concrete assessment is carried out by the provider and is not necessarily controlled by the national authorities. The provider can exploit this loophole to avoid the stricter regime for high risk. Moreover, the operational and technical capabilities of national authorities to actively control this kind of concrete risk assessment is also questionable. So we have this problem. Now the next risk level named by the Commission pyramid is the limited risk or the specific transparency risk. Although the AI Act does not provide clear criteria for classification, this AI system in this level would have to fulfill some transparency obligations set out in Article 50. However, if you look closely, we cannot conclude that there is such a risk level. At least it's not structurally below the high risk or the intermediary risk level. In fact, Article 50 identifies certain transparency risk and appropriate measures to minimize these risks. It does not make sense to classify an AI system as limited risk if these transparency obligations can also apply to high-risk AI system, as assumed in recital 132. I think the Commission has tried here to present an AI Act as a clearly defined risk-based approach with several levels of risk, but this does not reflect the actual regulation. So, in my opinion, there is no such thing as a limited risk level. Article 50 simply imposes transparency obligations on all AI systems that met the conditions set out by the different paragraphs of the Article 50. For example, according to Article 50, paragraph 1, if the AI system interacts directly with natural persons and there is a risk of manipulation, the provider whether the system is high risk or not, has to inform the natural person about the interaction with the machine. In other words, these transparency obligations are triggered by certain feature of AI systems and not because an AI system is classified as limited risk. And the last category, the last level of risk in the Commission's pyramid is the minimal risk. The AI Act does not mention this level either, and it does not provide any criteria for classification. However, the minimal risk is conceived as a residual category and covers all AI systems that are not classified as an acceptable risk, high risk, or limited risk if we consider it as a level of risk. In this way, the majority of AI systems will fall in this category. For the minimal risk AI systems, the AI Act does not create mandatory requirements. Instead, the AI Act only encourages the adoption of codes of conduct and voluntary compliance with the high-risk requirements. Here, the AI Act lacks also some coherence with regards to this risk level. As already discussed, the classification of high-risk systems is limited by the relevant harmonization legislation and the predefined areas in Annex 3. In the latter, the provider can access the concrete risk and declassify if the risks are not significant. For minimal risk, however, the legislation hasn't identified relevant risk through an abstract assessment, and because of that, it's not included in the Annex 3. However, there's no obligation or mechanism that enable a risk assessment of the minimal risk AI system to check if this minimal risk AI system actually poses a significant risk in some context. In other words, there's no clear way to determine where a particular minimal risk AI system should be reclassified as a high risk instead of minimal risk. That is not subject to any mandatory requirements. And as you can see, I'm here to bring more questions as answers because it's really new. We have a lot to discuss and to understand how the AI Act will actually work and which AI systems will be classified as high risk and other levels of risk if we find so. And to conclude my presentation, I would like to highlight some important points or issues that we have discussed and lead us to reconsider the high-risk approach of the AI Act. As we have seen, the key aspect of a high-risk, risk-based approach are well-defined levels of risk and a clear criteria for classifying AI systems. However, the AI Act lacks clarity, and the explanation from the Commission does not provide the actual structure of this regulation. In order to rethink the risk-based approach, I believe we need to address at least the following issues. The first one, what is the classification of unacceptable AI systems that the AI Act exceptionally allows? Should they automatically be considered high risk? Second one, what is the classification of AI system used in the predefined areas that does not pose significant risk? Should an intermediary category be identified? Third question, is limited risk or specific transparency risk really a risk level? And fourth, can minimal risk AI system pose significant risks in a specific context? And how to deal or adapt the regulation in these situations. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward for the discussion.
Should I continue now,
Yes,
and
yes,
then we
yes.
have questions at the end of the talk? Everybody can hear me, I guess, right? Yeah, perfect. Okay. Yeah, so after Gustavo's presentation on the kind of general structure, oh, what happened? No, I can't see. Okay, now it's back. After Gustavo's presentation of the general structure of the AI Act, I will talk about a phenomenon which kind of runs counter to this structure and doesn't necessarily neatly fit into these categories, and that is the issue of foundation models, which has been hotly debated for more than a year now, and is also experiencing a great hype in the media. And I'll talk about how foundation models are regulated under the AI Act, but also what the relations to other parts of EU law look like. And I'll first give a short introduction into foundation models. I'll then kind of focus on the obligation for foundation models under the AI Act. And then thirdly and fourthly, I'll talk about copyright issues and data protection issues, which kind of also lead us to other fields of EU law, before then giving potentially a short conclusion in the end. So what are foundation models? Generally speaking, we can define foundation models as machine learning models that are trained on broad data, such that they develop general capabilities which can then be applied across a wide range of use cases. So the most famous case of foundation models clearly are what we now call large language models, ChatGPT, and these issues. And that will be the column to the very left. But of course, there's also other categories such as image processing and generation models, audio processing and generation models, or models capable of processing structured data. So if we look at image processing models, the general capability of these models is that they can identify certain things in images, that they can generate images, and then we see that these general capabilities can be employed for specific functionalities, for specific applications, right? So this is what we see in the lower box. So for example, we can use these models for text to image creation. So we input a text and it outputs an image for us, but we can also use these models for other tasks such as image recognition, face recognition, or medical imaging, or identifying, where we're trying to identify certain medical conditions in image data. Whenever we talk about foundation models, it's extremely important that we remember that these foundation models do not kind of exist in a vacuum, but rather that they are part of a broader supply chain. And I think this illustration by the Ada Lovelace Institute is extremely helpful in understanding this supply chain. So what we see at the very top layer is what they call the data and compute layer. So for constructing a foundation model, we always need huge amounts of data, and we also generally need quite a lot of computation power. So that's kind of the resource layer at the very top. Then at the next layer, we have the foundation model layer. So this is where the actual foundation model gets constructed. So this would be GPT-4, for example, which is not yet at the layer of an actual product that users can interact with, but just the foundation model itself. Then we have a host layer. So we can imagine a foundation model as some kind of algorithm, a pretty complex algorithm. And of course, you need to make that algorithm accessible in some way, right? So either how this works is that the foundation model is hosted on some kind of web hosting service, or it's made available for download so that people can download it. And then finally, we have the application layer. And this is where the foundation model, through different techniques that we can apply, such as fine-tuning or using certain prompts, gets specified so that it's actually a software that you can interact with, right? So this is only the layer, the final layer, which end users will then interact with the application user. And the AI Act foresees obligations two levels in this supply chain. So for the application layer, we potentially have the obligations that Gustavo was talking about, high risk obligations for high risk systems or transparency obligations, that kind of thing. But then the final version now also includes obligations for the foundation models themselves, for the providers of a foundation model. And this is what I will talk about now in the following presentation. So why would we worry about foundation models? What are the kinds of risks that we might experience with foundation models? So I tried to categorize these just to give an overview of what you might worry about when using or when interacting with a foundation model. So of course, the first kinds of risks always relate to performance and robustness. So does the foundation model actually perform in the way that it's advertised, and does it perform in an appropriate manner? So to give an example, this could be that a facial recognition system doesn't actually recognize people correctly, but rather misrecognizes them. Or we could think about a text generation system, which is supposed to help journalists, but there's actually loads of misinformation in that system, and therefore the outputs are also affected by misinformation. So that's performance issues. These are kind of very central, I think. A second category of risks relates to privacy and cybersecurity. And two examples for this would be that personal information that a system was trained on is leaked, or also that personal information that the system was exposed to while running, that kind of information is leaked to parties that should not be able to access that information. We also have risks in the field of bias and discrimination, which have been talked about a lot in the last years. So what we could imagine here is that, say, an image recognition system, which we use for a car to kind of understand its surroundings, doesn't recognize disabled people or people in a wheelchair. That could be one example of a system which has a certain bias and therefore doesn't work right. We have risks relating to misuse and inappropriate use. So this relates to cases where a system was designed to perform a certain function, but then it's actually misused for other functions. So classic examples would be using a text generation system to produce misinformation, or using an image generation system to produce misleading photos, or even things like pornographic deepfakes. And then finally, we have risks relating to transparency and accountability, which kind of relate to all the other kinds of risks, where we're worried about the fact that we don't really understand why a system leads to certain outcomes or how it reaches certain decisions, and where we're also worried that we don't understand at which level of the supply chain these risks are generated, and who's therefore accountable and should be obliged to mitigate these risks, right? So that's kind of to give an introduction on foundation models and the risks of foundation models. How are these foundation models now regulated by the AI Act? The AI Act, first of all, calls foundation models general purpose AI models, or GPAI. I'm also going to use that word in the future. And at the very core of the regulation of foundation models is this distinction between normal general purpose AI models and then general purpose AI models with systemic risk. That's the vocabulary that the AI Act uses. And as you might imagine, there's a stricter set of obligations for GPAI systems with systemic risk, and less strict rules for normal GPAI systems. So let's first have a look at how this distinction between systemic risk systems and non-systemic risk systems works, because it's very crucial for understanding what systems will be subject to what obligations. So what the AI Act foresees is that a GPAI model shall be classified as systemic risk either, and that's number one here, if it has high impact capabilities evaluated on the basis of appropriate technical tools and methodologies. And the first criterion that the AI gives us here is that this should be presumed to be the case when the amount of compute used for training a GPAI system is greater than 10 to the power of 25 floating point operations. So floating point operations basically just a measure to measure the amount of compute that has gone into training a certain system. And when this threshold is surpassed, we will know that we're dealing with a systemic risk system. And then the second aspect, how we can also classify systems as pertaining high impact capabilities, is when the Commission has adopted new thresholds or has amended these thresholds. So we could imagine that, of course, as systems get more effective, for example, the number of floating point operations to produce a very capable system will go down, and therefore the Commission will need to lower these barriers because we'll just have lower compute in the future. So that's the first class. And then the second class is that a GPAI model can also be classified as systemic risks based on a decision by the Commission. So the Commission can just adopt the decision that a certain GPAI system will from now on be considered systemic risk, and then those those stricter obligations will apply. And the AI also foresees certain criteria which the Commission shall take into consideration when adopting these decisions. And these criteria include the capabilities of a system, its impact on the internal market, or also its number of registered users. What are we to make of this distinction? I think there's a couple of points which might be problematic. So first of all, if we are talking about these high impact capabilities, and we see that for now, so this might be changed in the future, but for now, the barrier is 10 to the power of 25 floating point operations. This is really the very top layer of foundation models at the moment. So I think we assume that GPT-4 was trained roughly on 10 to the 25, 10 to the power of 25 floating point operations. So we know that it's really just the kind of maybe a handful of systems at the moment that surpass this barrier. While of course we have dozens and dozens and potentially hundreds of foundation models already in existence, right? So we see that this is a very high threshold and will probably remain a very high threshold for the future. So that's one aspect I think one has to think about. And then secondly, I think, and this has also been criticized by commentators, all of these criteria are very much focused on certain technical specifications, right? They're not really focused much about the impact a certain system has or the risks a certain system poses. It really seems like the legislator is kind of wants to have hard technical barriers for classifying what is a systemic risk system and what is not a systemic risk system. And that also might be problematic because you might have systems which kind of are not that technically capable, but which still have a huge impact on society, and therefore you might want to regulate them stronger. Let's have a look at the obligations that GPAI models with systemic risk are subject to. So essentially, there is 4 obligations that these providers need to comply with. They have to, and I'm mostly quoting, I'm using the language of the Act. They have to perform model evaluation reflecting the state of the art, including conducting adversarial testing with a view to identify and mitigate systemic risk. The problem here is that there's no definition of model evaluation, so it's not really clear what this should mean. There is a definition of systemic risk, and this, I have it here. So systemic risk is defined as actual or reasonably foreseeable negative effects on public health, safety, public security, fundamental rights or the society as a whole. So that's kind of the risks that these providers have to test their systems for. That's obligation number one. Then also they have to assess and mitigate possible systemic risks at union level. They have to document and report serious incidents. And serious incidents are basically incidents where there's been a kind of great malfunctioning of a system. And finally, they have to ensure an adequate level of cybersecurity protection. Again, not really too clear what this should mean in the future. We see that all of these obligations are pretty vague. The idea is that these obligations should then be specified in kind of lower level legislation, namely codes of practice and harmonized standards. I'm not going to talk too much about what these processes look like, but I think what we and others worry about with these lower legislative processes is that they seem to be tilting towards really giving industry a lot more influence than other actors. So that might be a risk that there's not really a balanced representation of different interests when these vague obligations become actually defined to such a level that they become practical. So that's the obligations for systemic risk models. Let's have a look at the obligations for normal models. So this is all the other ones. And here we again have 4 obligations. So providers of normal GPAI models have to draw up technical documentation and provide it upon request to the competent authorities. You have to consider that this technical documentation is pretty basic. It's usually really just stuff which describes the system. What is the system supposed to do? How do you operate the system? What kinds of inputs can you use the system with? I think there's one interesting aspect that must be included in this technical documentation, and it's information on the data used for training, testing, and validation, how the data was obtained and selected, as well as why the data might be unsuitable for the purposes for which the system will be used. So that, I think, is kind of the, to my understanding, the only helpful point of information that needs to be included in this technical documentation. The same information also has to be made available for downstream providers. So we remember that we have the foundation model layer, but then we also have downstream companies that use these foundation models, and the same information also has to be made available to these downstream actors so that they can comply with their own duties, so that they know what data the system was trained on, etc. And finally, and I'll get to these last 2 obligations in a second, GPAI providers also have to put in place a policy to respect union copyright law, and they have to make publicly available a sufficiently detailed summary about the data used for training the GPAI. And there'll be a template for how this summary shall look like, provided by the AI office, which is a new governance body established by the EU. And again, all of these duties will be specified through codes of practice and harmonized standards. What should we think of this overall approach to regulating GPAI systems or foundation model systems? I think we see, generally we see something that we've also seen with the regulatory approach in a broader sense, that the legislator wants to target those actors that kind of pose the biggest risks or that have the biggest influence, and therefore you have this tiered approach where only systemic risk models actually have any substantial obligations. I mean, all of this is basically only transparency obligations and not very extensive transparency obligations at that. And you want to keep all the other foundation models largely unregulated because you kind of worry that everything else will impact innovation or will impact the market and those kinds of issues. And I think that clearly isn't a completely unreasonable approach. But I think both from an economic perspective as well as from a kind of rights-oriented perspective, it doesn't really make too much sense, because there's now been the first studies on what this regulatory cost actually looks like, right? For a foundation model provider, like how substantial are these costs that you expect when trying to comply with the obligations of the AI Act, and compared to the costs that you will have anyways, because building a foundation model is just not a very cheap thing to do. Those costs are absolutely minimal, right? So therefore, this kind of idea that we really need to spare foundation model providers from having to comply with any obligations, because otherwise it will be too costly and nobody wants to innovate in Europe anymore, seems very dubious at the very least to me. Whereas you also have to consider that what is the obligations that will not be complied with at the foundation model will basically need to be complied with at the application model, right? So somebody has to deal with these risks. And I would think that it would have made more sense to deal with more of these risks at the foundation model, because yeah, that way they don't trickle down, and even from an economic perspective, it would arguably, I would argue, make more sense. So that's kind of the general approach to regulating foundation models, or GPAI models, as the AI calls them. Let's look at a more specific issue, namely copyright issues. So does anybody have an idea what we see on this photo? Genvi? I mean, I don't know if you've kind of encountered these early generated photos. They always look a bit kind of vague in the most detailed areas, right? Like faces are not really represented that well. So this is clearly a photo that has been generated by a text-to-image generation tool. And the funny thing about it is that it has this watermark of Getty Images, right? I mean, the text probably, the person asking for it didn't ask for a photo specifically licensed by Getty Images. It just asked for like a photo of somebody on a red carpet. But this shows us, or what this showed us, was that this model that was used in this specific case, called Stable Diffusion, was clearly trained on photos from Getty Images, which are obviously copyright protected photos. And Getty Images, for that reason, was made aware that their images have been used, and now there's all these lawsuits running against Stable Diffusion and also other foundation model providers. Whereas on a global scale, and especially also in the American context, it's still very much unclear how these copyright issues will be dealt with. The interesting thing for us here in Europe, I think, is that on the substantive level, it's already pretty clear what the law looks like. Specifically, what we need to talk about here is the EU Digital Single Market Copyright Directive from, I think, 4 years ago or something, and Article 4 of it. And Article 4 says, member states shall provide for an action or limitation to copyrights for reproductions and extractions of lawfully accessible works and other subject matter for the purposes of text and data mining. And what we need to know here is that, so data mining is generally some kind of automated extraction of information from a large swath of data. And this also applies to foundation model training, as we now know, because the AI Act references Article 4, so we know that AI training will be considered data mining and therefore falls under this exception. And this importantly means that you can train your system on copyright protected works, and that's in line with EU copyright. Now there's an exception to this rule, which is paragraph 3. The exception or limitation provided for in paragraph 1 shall apply only on condition that the copyright has not been expressly reserved by their rights holders in an appropriate manner, such as machine-readable means in the case of content made publicly available online. What does this mean in simple terms? It means that if you're the rights holder of a certain copyright, if you have expressed a reservation, it cannot be used for AI training any longer. So there's a rule that it's okay to train on copyright protected material, but it's not okay if the rights holder has expressed a reservation and has publicly stated that their works cannot be trained on. This is the substantive law. What's now really going to be crucial in the future is how are rights holders actually supposed to express their reservations? How will this work in practice? And what we know from this provision is that these expressions have to be machine readable. So we can call these opt-outs, right? Copyright opt-outs. So there's a rule that it can be used, but it cannot be used if there's been an opt-out by the rights holder. So the question is, how will rights holders be able, or how will rights holders be obliged to communicate these opt-outs? And the interesting thing is, there's currently already a number of such protocols being developed through which rights holders can express their reservations. There's one called Spawning AI, which is extremely interesting, and I recommend everybody to have a look at it. There's also an initiative by Google and a couple of others. The interesting thing about this is that all of these protocols work on the level of a website. So how it works is basically, if you host a website and you don't want others to use the materials made accessible on that website to be used for AI training, you add some metadata to that website, which kind of shows to everybody else that this material cannot be used for AI training. So this is generally, I think this was adopted because it's technically pretty easy to implement, but there is really a lot of problems with this approach. And the first problem with this is that you can't actually technically enforce these reservations. So you can only show to everybody else, please don't use these materials for training your foundation models, but there's no way of technically enforcing that. So that means that observance right now is only voluntary, right? The other problems are that, of course, there's a difference between a website which hosts a certain copyright protected work and the work itself, right? But if you, for example, upload your copyright protected photographs to your website, in the age of the internet, those photos can just be copied to another page, and then if you're not in control of that other page as well, you won't be able to express your reservation any longer. And then thirdly, and I think this is maybe the issue that I'm kind of most interested in, how it will be resolved. Of course, you also have to consider that in this day and age, few copyright protected works are actually made available through a website that the copyright holder owns, right? Because most of them are made available through other platforms, and that could be YouTube, that can be photo platforms, that can be TikTok or SoundCloud. So these websites need to implement certain means through which then the copyright holders can express their reservations. And I think right now there's, as far as I know, there has been no consideration of how this is actually going to work. So that's the issues with operationalizing these opt-outs. The second aspect, which is also important for these copyright questions, is what level of transparency will these foundation model providers need to provide regarding their training data? Because in the end, if you don't know what works a certain system has been trained on, it's extremely hard for you as a copyright holder to enforce your copyright, right? Because you just don't know if your work has been used or not. This is what the AI Act says about this issue. Providers of GPAI models shall draw up and make publicly available a sufficiently detailed summary about the content used for training of the GTAI model, according, again, to a template provided by the AI office. And then we also have a recital which says that to determine this level of detail, we have to take into consideration trade secrets. The summary should be generally comprehensive in its scope. It should facilitate parties with legitimate interests to exercise and enforce their rights. So this is copyright holders, for example. It should list the main data collections or sets, or it could also provide a narrative explanation about other data used. And what is interesting about, so I think the first thing that kind of pops up is, what is a sufficiently detailed summary? That's kind of a contradiction in itself, right? Like either you have to provide a summary on what data you've trained on, or it's detailed to such a degree that rights holders will actually know if their works have been used or not. So this will really be crucial in determining whether rights holders can actually enforce their rights, which is, I would argue, is probably only the case if you really know what websites went into the training or what works went into the training. Because if all you need to do is to kind of say 25% of our training data was taken from the publicly available internet, of course that doesn't help anybody. In the AI right now, we have this kind of undefined compromise. I think the parties couldn't really reach a compromise that would be workable. So now we'll have to see what the AI office makes of this transparency obligation, and then whether that will actually help copyright holders or whether it will largely remain ineffective. So much to copyright issues. I'm now gonna talk about the last aspect, and then I think we'll wrap this up, which is data protection issues. As you might know, we have a general data protection regulation in the EU, and this, the GDPR, and the GDPR has not been set aside by the AI Act, so it will apply parallel to the AI Act, right? But what are, again, kind of looking at risks or looking at possible complaints, what are the interests related to data protection that people could worry about or could legitimately worry about, right? So first of all, of course, there might be an issue of these systems memorizing and leaking private data. And this is something that we've seen in the past, where you can prompt a system in such a way that it outputs private data. That could be personal address or personal telephone numbers, that kind of stuff. So there need to be safeguards for these systems to not leak this private data. That's one issue. The other issue is just what I call here unconsented appropriation. So it's personal data which has been used to build these systems, and you might think, well, this, from a kind of property perspective on data protection, you might think that this is your data and other people can't just use it to build their products. You also might worry about misrepresentation. We've also seen this in the past. So if you kind of ask, say, ChatGPT, can you give me information on person X or Y? It gives, it outputs misinformation, and that's something why you might want to have these systems not be able to kind of talk about you at all. And then finally, there also might be privacy violations through inference. This is something which is currently still, I think, researched and unclear. But what people worry about here is that as these systems are so comprehensive and have so much knowledge, they are also able to infer other data when given some input data, right? So for example, if you communicate with a system for a long enough time frame, just based on the words that you use, the system might be able to understand what country you come from or what region you come from. Might also be able to infer your racial background or your ethnic background and those kinds of things. So that's another field of of potential risks. what are the remedies that the GDPR potentially brings us to remedy these risks? There's a large list of provisions of the GDPR that could kind of interact with foundation models. And the first of these clearly is Article 6, which regulates the general lawfulness of processing data. So as you might know, under the GDPR, you're not just able to process personal data, you have to be able to justify this processing. And two reasons how you might be able to justify your processing of personal data is legitimate interest. You have a legitimate interest to process that data, or you've been given the consent of the individual. Other articles that we still need to kind of wait how they will be applied to the context of foundation models is the right to access. So every individual under the GDPR has a right to access personal data that is stored on them. And it's unclear whether this means that that if you ask OpenAI, for example, whether they need to give all the data that they have on you. Yeah, so that's still unclear how this will be applied to the context of foundation models. And maybe one last point, the issue of objection and erasure. So as you also might know, we have this so-called right to be forgotten in the EU, which is basically a right to have personal data erased. How this works is that you as an individual can object to the processing of your data, and then if the data processor doesn't have any overriding legitimate grounds, it will need to stop processing your data. And again, it's unclear whether this means that individuals can just complain to OpenAI and say, please stop processing my personal data, and whether OpenAI in that case would then need to stop processing it, or whether there might indeed be overriding legitimate grounds. Of course, kind of above all of this, there's also the question, what will be determined to be data relating to an identified or identifiable natural person, which is the basic condition for the GDPR to be applicable in the first place. So let's just look at one provision here, the lawful basis of legitimate interest, Article 6, 1F GDPR, which says processing shall be lawful if processing is necessary for the purposes of the legitimate interest pursued by the controller, except where such interests are overridden by the interests or fundamental rights and freedoms of the data subject. So as of yet, it's still unclear whether foundation model companies are able to justify their operations on this legal basis. There's doubts expressed by the Italian, Polish, and French data protection authorities. There's really quite little precedence on this question. I think one case that might be deemed to be substantial precedence is the case of Clearview. I don't know if you're familiar with this case. Clearview is basically a facial recognition system that was trained on loads of photos from the internet and has been ruled illegal under the GDPR. So if that is any indication, that's clearly precedents kind of running counter to the interests of foundation model providers. Yeah, but we'll really still have to see how this kind of balance of interests will be reached under the GDPR. And this is the final thing that I want to talk about, this right to object under the GDPR. So as I just mentioned, data subjects have a right to object on grounds relating to their particular situation to the processing of personal data under points E or F of Article 6. So this also includes the legitimate interest basis that we just saw. And objected, the controller shall no longer process the personal data unless the controller demonstrates compelling legitimate grounds for the processing which override the interests, rights, and freedoms of the data subject. And again, this is so. it's unclear on a substantive level what this means, whether fundamental providers actually will be able to demonstrate these compelling legitimate grounds, but it's also unclear how this will work on a practical level, right? How us individuals should be able to raise our objection to the processing of our personal data. And yeah, this is one could think that this works through what is called data removal requests. Basically, you send an email to OpenAI saying, I object to the processing of my personal data, and then they have to stop processing your data. But I think what will probably be needed is some form of objection infrastructure, meaning whenever you share personal data online, and that could be on social media platforms, that could be in other kinds of platforms, there should be a way for you to express proactively that this data should not be available for training AI systems. At least that would be my hope, that we'll kind of get to that point in the future. So yeah, this was a snapshot of all the issues that foundation models pose for regulation and for the AI Act in particular. And yeah, I think Gustavo and me are really looking forward to getting into a conversation now. Yeah, that'll be it from our side for now, and then we're looking forward to discussing this.
I think that you all agree with me when I say that it was a very technical, very complex regulation. And I thank you very much for your contribution, all the light that you have provided to us. And you have any question?
So, thank you very much, especially to the Cátedra of Notariado and Professor Phil and Professor Gil. It's been a very interesting two speeches. And I would like to make a couple of questions, if it is possible. If we don't have time, yes. The first thing is that I totally agree with your view of the different risk assets in the Artificial Intelligence Act. There is no logical structure. I mean, there is an acceptable risk, but unacceptable except if we are talking about military and if we are talking about law enforcement. And this is something surprising because there is a lot of challenging with human rights and law enforcement and human rights and military actions with artificial intelligence. But they are not unacceptable, they are unacceptable. And then we have the high risk. I would like to make one question to you. Do you think that this high risk category is going to affect the same to the big players like Microsoft, Apple, Google, and all this, and the small and medium businesses? Because in Europe, we have small and medium businesses, especially in artificial intelligence markets. We are not the big players, and sometimes people here in Europe are worried if this Artificial Intelligence Act is going to be easier to comply for the big ones and more tough for our small and medium. And then I think it's been also very interesting all about generative artificial intelligence. Well, the thing is that while the European Union was working on the Artificial Intelligence Act, in this very moment while they were dancing from one place to another, it erupted ChatGPT.
Right.
So they don't know. I mean, it was something surprising.
Yeah.
So I have one couple of questions. How do you think that this legislation, this regulation, could affect, for example, in the political arena?
Mm-hmm.
Because this year, 2024, as you know, is the great general elections year. I mean, there are elections all around the world. We have here in Spain, the Basque, Catalonian, European, not Europe, of course. But we have the American we have had the Russians elections or whatever, whatever they have done. And how do you think the elections have been affected by generative artificial intelligence? Do you think that we are protected enough? Yeah, because then I have some issues with copyright. Copyright is something that is imagine that we are a screen player writer, and they take all our screenplays.
Yeah.
They train at ChatGPT, and afterwards they make new screenplays, and I am redundant.
Yeah.
This is what is happening.
Yeah.
So how?
Yeah.
I mean, what can I do? I mean, I'm redundant because of they have trained the ChatGPT with all my works.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
well, I don't want to monopolize. Thank you very much to the Cátedra and to you both professors.
Should we
Okay, you
answer
go.
now? So about the question on the high risk and how it will impact different companies, big players and small players, I don't think it will impact the same, especially because we have now this exception on the significant risk. And what I think is going to happen, the big players will be will be controlled by the national authorities, because they can't control every player that consider the AI system as known high risk. And what we can have here is national authorities controlling just the big players when they consider the systems as no high risk. And then we can have a difference here, which systems will be controlled by the national authorities. And that can be a big difference with this exception for the classification for high risk AI systems. I think that's the big difference we can see in the couple of years.
I mean, if you want to say something about the other two questions, you just say something after me, but I can. Yeah, I think two really interesting questions. So the first one, are we protected enough against influence by deepfakes, that kind of stuff, but also maybe bots spreading misinformation, etc. Very important question. So how I think about this is that, so we have these transparency obligations where systems need to, this is very much unclear how this will work in practice, if that's going to be, if there's actually going to be a provable way how we can identify whether certain contents have been generated by an AI system or not. But this is clearly one obligation which works into that direction, which could help us potentially say that there's what is called watermarks on artificially generated photos and that kind of stuff. But I think, so how I kind of think about this is that I'm not really sure whether AI, the level of AI systems is necessarily the best one to counter these specific risks, because ultimately you always, I mean, you need, so you have the AI system which kind of generates misinformation, for example, but then you also need ways of spreading that misinformation, right? And these are also, some of them, most of them are regulated. The big social media platforms are regulated by the Digital Services Act. And personally, I think that this is probably the better location for targeting these risks, because it's, as far as I understand, that the kind of technical measures of identifying these large influence operations, you can better identify them on the social media level than by trying to, at this point, when we have open source systems, there's anyways no way of completely eradicating, say, misinformation generation, or so that's not really possible. And I think I'm absolutely no expert, but my perspective would be that, like, targeting the ways through which misinformation or fake content kind of gets distributed is probably more effective at this point. And then regarding your comment on copyright and how the system is unfair towards creators, I very much agree. I think, of course, there's objections then that this has always been the case. There's always been new technologies. There's new creators, and now the next people will be those that maybe, you know, like the person that uses ChatGPT to write their screenplay needs just as much protection as the one before. If you agree with that on a social and philosophical level is a very different question, I think. What I think is kind of the issue is that, so yeah, whatever. I mean, this is only my personal opinion, but what I think is not really fair is that I think the general structure that it's legal to train on copyright protected data, but you can express an objection to that, and then your work cannot be trained on that. Kind of makes sense to me, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
If that is practical, like if that works in practice, I think it's an acceptable system, because then obviously you can also whatever, like say take music. I mean, rights holders obviously they don't represent their interests themselves. They have big companies who represent all of the German musicians, or like 30% of the German musicians, whatever. All of them say you can't train on our material. You can train on our material if you compensate us with such and such million euros or whatever. And I think like this is really the question, whether there'll be compensation structures which make sense, so that creators actually can make money. We live in an age where every technological innovation makes it harder for creators to make money, I think. And yeah, it would be great if this isn't the case with generative AI. I'm a bit skeptical, but I think that's really the crucial issue, kind of. But yeah, I don't know if you want to add something. No. Yeah.
I would like to ask Gustavo, if you can explain us which is the definition of AI in the Act, because artificial intelligence is everything or not. How is it?
Yeah, they changed now in the adopted version. They adopted the OCDE concept of AI systems, and it's a broad concept. It can cover a lot of systems.
A calculation sheet.
Yeah, there are more complex systems and there are more simple systems, and that's why we have a lot of discussions on the classification, because if you're talking about systems, simple systems that are used on critical areas, they will be classified as high-risk systems, also when they don't pose some significant risk, because they just allows you to organize your files in a more smart way, and not gives you recommendation or makes a decision. It's just a way to better organize. And that's the problem with this classification, because you need always you try to target some AI systems, but if you target with the areas in which they are used, you will cover a lot of systems that are not really complex and don't need a strict regulation. And that's why there are a lot of discussions whether we should cover all the system in a specific area, or how can we adjust the regulation for these different kinds of systems that can be named AI. And it also can be an interesting development in the future, that many companies can say that their systems are not AI, are something else, because right now everything is AI. You see,
everything is smart.
Every product is AI in it, and maybe in the future the companies will try to avoid this classification. No, mine is not AI because with technical arguments, and we'll see how it will develop.
Yeah, because the same concept, the same name, AI is controversial.
Yes.
It's ideological. Or,
Yes, it's hard to there's no clear definition.
and I think this is a main issue in this act. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
It also reminds me, like recently, I had this prospect of a supermarket, but like the supermarket doesn't only sell food, also sells like home appliances and that kind of stuff. And they're selling a coffee machine, and the prospect said now with AI, and you're like, how is a coffee machine supposed to? I mean, it's a marketing term mostly, but yeah.
It is subject to this act.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Yeah.
No.
Any other questions?
Oh, I'm interested also in which was the position of the French government concerning the act.
I think there was some discussion from the French government. They were afraid to regulate AI in a kind of way that would avoid the development of AI in the EU. That was the discussion, and there was also a discussion if the AI Act would be approved. If
Macron was personally concerned.
Yeah,
personally concerned, and also Germany was concerned, and there was some fear that it wouldn't be approved after all, because
they were trying to protect their own industries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the reason they use to protect the industries, because they say that we in the EU are already in disadvantage in comparison with the USA, with the development, or China with development of AI, and if we have here stricter rules that could be problematic to develop here and EU AI systems, but I don't think that's the point. We need to develop AI systems that is according to our fundamental rights, the environment concerns, and security. It's not that we don't need regulation.
Yeah, maybe to add one point to this, I think there's also like something that I also don't really agree with, is this idea that we don't have strong tech companies in the EU because we have so much regulation. And I think this is also what economists say, is that the issue isn't necessarily the regulation. The issue is much more that we don't have those kinds of venture capital structures that you have in the US. Investors in the EU are much more risk adverse. There's generally much less investment. And what you really would need to counter to remedy this lack of European innovation or European companies is either provide more public funding or supporting private investments through additional public funds and that kind of stuff. But the fact whether you regulate foundation models in a stricter way or in a lesser way will most probably not have any effect on whether there's going to be a European foundation model provider or not. Yeah, so I think that's like also one dimension to kind of keep in mind. Yeah.
Yeah. So, to summarize, you think your assessment of the act is positive? Or?
Yeah, I think it's positive, but we have a lot of challenges in front of us, because we don't know exactly how it will work and how it will be effective to control the AI and the development of AI systems. And yeah, we have to wait now that we have this act to see if there will be a positive impact. But I'm positive about it.
Yeah. I agree. I think there's so many more decisions that need to be reached with all these codes of conduct and the standards, which would actually contain the substance of many of the obligations. Those will be really crucial for then evaluating whether this is actually a success or not. No.
Okay, if there's any other questions, so we finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.